Hi, I am Mike DeCesare. I am CEO of FORESCOUT Technologies, and I would like to speak to you this morning a little bit about the challenges that we as an IT organization or an industry are dealing with relative to the explosion of IoT and OT and all the different devices that are coming onto the world. My background is that I ran McAfee for about 5 years before I joined FORESCOUT, so I've had the experience of running kind of one of the larger, more legacy-based security companies, obviously a very big footprint. So I had a chance kind of firsthand to see some of the challenges that the endpoint vendors were dealing with as they were trying to deal with kind of the new challenges that come on relative to the explosion of IoT. But I think to understand this, the first and most important step is to understand kind of how have we gotten to where we are in 2018. So if we back up to 2000, 18 years ago, there were about 700 million devices connected on the entire planet at that stage. And the characteristic of those devices, when you looked at your IT organizations, at that point, you substantially were able to control every device that you were allowing online. You would buy a Unix server and you would outfit it with SAP or some application, whatever security that you wanted, and you would put it into your data centers. You'd buy Windows laptops for our employees, and we would be able to load them with antivirus and encryption and DLP and all the different technologies that we wanted and test those machines and then give those devices to our employees. And when we started to allow our employees to use mobile devices, it was predominantly a BlackBerry. And the characteristic, as you all know, of a BlackBerry is it spoke to a server in the data center, also sold by BlackBerry, called the BlackBerry Enterprise Server, so that there was a way to validate that device as being secure before it touched your internal networks in any way. I remember the first time that the iPhone came out, which was about 10 years ago this year, and my fight with my IT department about allowing that iPhone to come onto the company's network. And this huge amount of debate, because at that stage, the iPhone, it wasn't owned by the company. It was, you know, your children might have your iPhone over the weekend and download Angry Birds or some application that they want to use, and then Monday morning you come into the work environment and that device is expected to be allowed online. And at that stage, really OT, there wasn't this concept of OT or operational technology systems being in the general population of other devices that were inside an organization. So the really kind of base characteristic at this stage is that organizations like yours, CIOs, CISOs, fundamentally would be able to control everything that was on the network at this stage. And if we fast forward this, let's go to 2015. It's now about 16 billion devices online. So that same 700 million, 15 years later, has spiked up to about 16 billion devices. You now have to deal with hundreds of thousands of operating systems being involved in your environment, not the several operating systems that you did 15 years ago. The percentage of devices that you now have the ability to purchase and load and test is coming down by the minute, and what instead is replacing that is with a lot of systems from BYOD to IoT to OT, devices that just are totally different in the way that they behave. They're either owned by an employee so that you can't impose your security standards on those devices, or they're closed operating systems that don't have the ability to load security products on them. And those same CIOs, CISOs now have to deal with a world where you're expected to allow everything into your environment and then make sense of those things on the back end. Obviously, it's a substantially different set of challenges. And as we project ahead, Gartner, every statistic here has a little bit different number because the acceleration of IoT is so severe, but Gartner says that in a couple of short years, we're going to be sitting here with about 30 billion connected devices online. Now, obviously, all of those are not into the corporate world, but a substantially large percentage of those are finding their way into corporations. What I think is really interesting is in the next year or so, we're going to be in a stage where we're adding about 328 million devices to the planet every 30 days. That means every 30 days, we're adding as many devices as it took half as many devices as the first 11 years of the internet coming online. This acceleration is absolutely overwhelming. My personal view as we look ahead into the future is that we are going to be in a situation, you are going to be in a situation as IT leaders where in some short number of years, I don't know the number, but 99% of all the devices that will be in your environments, you won't own anymore. You won't have that ability to test them, to put them into production in a very measured way. You're going to have to deal with this acceleration of devices that is coming into your environment. You also might be in the same situation where, again, maybe 99% of all your data is moved up into the cloud. I mean, as IT leaders, we all understand this, but as IT leaders, the ground underneath our feet is changing at such a radical pace. The foundation of the high-tech industry is just changing at such an incredible pace. And obviously, all aspects of our lives are coming online during this window as well. Our cars are online, our houses are coming online. It's very reasonable to assume that many of those type of things will find their way into corporations. So this device growth is definitely a very large and important and growing piece of the complexity of the IT landscape. To build on that a little bit, though, another challenge that you're dealing with is around edge computing. And this one actually, in my view, might be larger than simply the volume of devices that are on your network. In my position, edge computing is going to change everything for corporations. Because if you back up again 15 years ago to 2000, or even today for that matter, your data center, which is the smallest number of assets, you can protect the most closely. The most powerful machines in your environment are the ones that you secure the most tightly. And as you build that ring and you move away from that, you then have your laptops, the open systems, Unix, Windows, the machines that you have a chance to really test and give to your employees are the next most powerful. And as you move out into the IoT world, those get to be less powerful devices. It's important to secure your printers and your security cameras and your TVs and your HVAC controllers and your voice over IP phones and all of those other use cases, but we do recognize that the processing power, the complexity of those devices gets smaller the farther away you move from the data center. Edge computing is going to change that in a very substantial way for us. And I want to explain this to you through the lens of one of our customers that is going through this process. So one of the public utilities in a large US city, the organization responsible for the smart city, kind of securing the organization, purchased our product about 3 or 4 years ago. And the reason that I use this as an example is their use case was quite interesting. They had TVs, cameras, that were on top of every traffic light in the city. And at this stage, those cameras fed what would be effectively a DVR. They held about 30 days worth of video on every camera, and if there was an accident at some stage, that camera was used to try and make sure they figured out who was at fault. And when we first started working with this customer, they went through an upgrade of those machines, and what they wanted to do, instead of feeding 30 days of a video loop, they wanted to feed a team of people that was there, and those people were now using the output of those cameras to be able to do gunshot detection. So their concept was that if there was a gunshot in the city, they could triangulate the feeds from the cameras and that they could deploy police officers to the scene much quicker because they would know where the gunshot came from. Then they moved about a year later to IBM, and they purchased Watson, and they wanted to replace, supplement that team of people with artificial intelligence. And their concept was that they could get quicker and quicker and quicker as far as their responsiveness. So why do I tell you this story relative to the area of edge computing is what also happened through these 3 phases was they put more and more powerful security cameras on top of the traffic lights. Now we sit in a situation in this city where the processing power of the security cameras, of which there's tens of thousands around the city, is more powerful than their Unix servers were 5 years ago. So they're sitting and dealing now with the opposite. They're, instead of having the data center that is the most trusted and critical assets, and then the next ring of their laptops, and then the next ring of their IoT devices, they see their IoT devices, the large ring, as being the largest threat vector in that environment. So, and I think as we look out across all different use cases here, we don't just have to grapple with the volume of devices that's coming into our environments. We have to deal with the fact that a lot of these devices that are coming online are very attractive for the bad actors because they have a lot of horsepower to them. They have the ability to process things at a very, very fast clip. The third kind of complexity from an IT landscape that really plays into the whole concept around IoT and the device growth is the evolution of the network. Kind of if you back up to that 2010 timeframe, many of your organizations probably face these same challenges today. The network itself was a large, flat thing, but it was segmented in the sense that OT was kind of theoretically air-gapped away from IT, and that data center was very controlled in what it could speak to. There was very, very few unified business processes that were existing between the different rings of the network. There was a lot of human beings and manual processes to deal with things, but there was definitely less overlap of those things. But as we take a look at that network, that same network as it moves forward, it has changed substantially. And e-commerce and all the different things that we expect from an online experience have forced us to be able to be much more measured in the way that we interface these networks. And I'll explain this through a story to you about my hometown. I live right outside of San Francisco, and our power company is called PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. And for as many years as I can ever remember owning a house, about every 90 days, PG&E would pull up in their van in front of the house, and they would knock on your door. If you weren't home, they'd go away and come back. And eventually, when you answered the phone, all they wanted to do was get inside your garage so they could spend 10 seconds and read your power meter so they could invoice you correctly for the amount of power that you used. And they went through this entire upgrade of smart meters, where they came, and if you go to the side of my house now and you look at the PG&E box, it's now got this little thing on top of it that looks like a computer in a certain way. And all that thing does is when they want to know how much power I've used, they beacon down electronically, pull that, and they can invoice me correctly. Seems like a very easy and simple use case. It's the movement of IoT into the OT side. So why do I tell you this story? Because instantaneously, when that went live, my house, which is effectively the OT network, is now connected to the IT network. Because now, a bad actor, should they get into my house, has the potential to use that connection to get back into the IT side of that organization. And this really highlights to us this concept that most of our networks, although we would like to say otherwise, they're large, flat networks. And although we've done our best to use different security products to try and secure access of what can move between what, we see breach after breach that exploits that and finds a vulnerability and is able to move more laterally. So when you look at each of these three use cases, what this is really showing is that we have this major visibility gap inside of our organizations. It's in a certain way, it's like asynchronous warfare, where the bad actor needs to find one way into your organization, but the good companies, you folks, and the cybersecurity companies that are trying to help you on this mission, we must secure every single different way into the organization. And the illustration is showing you it's a little bit like a house, right? If you had, a front door and a few windows in the house, then you'd have to be able to secure it in one way. You might be able to see both those doors that are going on simultaneously. But if that house all of a sudden had 10 windows and 100 windows and 1,000 windows, obviously our ability to make sure that every one of those windows is secured, it kind of goes down in a pretty substantial way for us. And this really highlights, when you look at the device growth, kind of the complexity of edge computing, the growth of the network and the complexity that the new generation of SDN and networking is going to impose into each of your environments. All of those things really come together in this fairly major trend that we are trying to deal with, which is this visibility gap that's inside of organizations. And I'll just pick one of our customers. I won't use them by name, but they're a Fortune 50 bank. When they first purchased our product, which was about 3 or 4 years ago, 25% of the devices in their environment they would have classified as IoT. And I'm going to define that as kind of closed systems or unmanaged systems, managed versus unmanaged. 75% of their devices were managed, meaning that they could buy those devices and load product on them and put them into production in a very measured way. And 25% of the systems would be unmanaged. That could be OT, it could be BYOD, devices that your employees bring that you don't have as much control over. Those could be IoT, things like security cameras and TVs that are not open systems. If you use a Nest thermostat at home, that's probably a pretty good example where that thermostat is not designed to run cybersecurity products on it, right? The hardware and the operating system and the application is all one controlled thing, but yet it's a node on the network, in this case, my house network. But that same customer, 3 years later, now has 25% managed devices and 75% unmanaged devices in a 36-month process. What's also interesting in this customer is the CIO swore to me a few years ago that they would be one of the last companies to move to the cloud. They've already moved 30% of all application loads they have in their environment up to the cloud in 3 years. Very big foundational shift out there. So when we look at this visibility gap, we try to think about kind of what these challenges impose into our environments. What is it as an IT industry that we can do to try and protect ourselves? I mean, these are some fairly large challenges, so what is it that you can do as IT professionals or that the cybersecurity companies can do to help you through this process? Now, this is a little bit self-serving because I run FORESCOUT and this is a space that we are in, but we see this every day. So we want to try to share with you a little bit about kind of what do we see as the best defense against this growing visibility gap. The first, and it sounds so very basic, but you have to understand what's on your network. I know it sounds so very fundamental, but obviously we wouldn't, breach after breach. If you knew that that bad thing was on your network doing the bad thing, you wouldn't have allowed it to be there to begin with. But the reality is, as the number of devices grow, the expansion grows, it's just understanding a simple baseline asset management of what is on your network is a very difficult thing to accomplish, but a very important aspect of this. When we go into an organization, the biggest, most highly successful IT organizations that we do business with, we routinely find about 30% more devices on your networks than you thought that you had before the product was installed. And obviously, you can put every cybersecurity product in the world on 99% of the devices, and the reality is that the bad actors are going to figure out how to get in through the 1% that you might not even know that are there to begin with. So, easier said than done. What do solutions have to do to be able to give you that perspective? And there's just some very fundamental architectural differences that you need to contemplate versus what you did for the first 25 years of the internet. And again, since I ran one of the larger agent-based products, I had a first-hand seat at this. But the reality is, when you back up to 2010, one of the characteristics was most of the products that you would deploy in your environments followed the same architectural model of being agent-based. Now, when Windows and Linux and iOS represented the vast majority of the devices that you allowed into your environments, this worked. I remember when I ran McAfee, and we had one team that supported the Apple environment, and a different team that supported the Windows environment, and a third team that supported the Linux environment. Even the biggest companies had challenges trying to keep up to date on all the different operating systems that you were bringing into your environment. But in an agent-based approach, that's your only option. If you're a supplier of product and you're going to have a little bit of software or an agent that runs on every device that you want to interact with, then you have to continue to keep up with your current version of every single operating system that every one of your collective customers wants to have in your environment. That is not practical in 2018. the number of new operating systems, the number of diverse devices, many of those devices being closed. You couldn't even load a security product on those devices if you wanted to, has created this issue where you need to be agentless. It's impractical anymore. When there was a number of very open few operating systems, the antivirus industry, the SIM industry, the system management industry, they all followed the same architectural model of having that agent-based approach. But it's always a test that I do when I meet with our customers is I ask them, how much of your cyber budget is on your managed operating systems? Again, Windows, Linux. How much of your cyber budget is on your unmanaged operating systems? And that is usually not a very high number. But as we continue to move forward, if you buy into this concept that edge computing and that these more powerful devices, things like the Mirai botnet, right? Why did they choose security cameras? Because they have a lot of horsepower and they can process a lot of I/O. That's why the bot herder chose the security cameras, but there's going to be many, many of these things. It's not practical to turn around each time and say, oh gosh, our security camera manufacturers need to be more responsible. If we were going to follow that approach, we would have gone back 20 years and we would have expected Dell and HP and the PC manufacturers to provide antivirus on their systems, but we didn't. An industry called antivirus grew because you wanted a common approach towards machines, but just recognize that as we move through this diversity of devices, that is not practical. The second thing is that the solutions that you choose need to be heterogeneous. If you're an endpoint-based product and you have an agent, then you need to have the heterogeneity of running on every single operating system that you bring into your environment. If you are a network-based approach, like we are, then you have to have the heterogeneity of running on every network operating system. And I know many of you are either Cisco shops or you're Juniper shops, but the reality is you're buying businesses and they might not be the same network. And even if you're able to standardize on one network inside your organization, you're going to go to places like AWS and Azure and Google, and they don't use the same network gear that you might have chosen. So as this industry continues to unfold, the reality is that we cannot count on one network provider securing the infrastructure for the entire world. Whatever solutions you choose need to be heterogeneous. They need to be able to work in an environment where you have mixed network environments. And then potentially most importantly is they need to be real-time and continuous. Devices, it's not good enough to have, you have a policy that says no XP is allowed in my environment, but that's a piece of paper. When we go into most organizations that have that policy and we look online, we're like, you have 80 XP devices online right now. As IT organizations, you need to understand in real time what it is that is on your network so that you can make decisions about where you broker those resources to remediate things appropriately. Second, and I know it sounds very basic as well, but you have to understand what is speaking to what. It's not good enough just to understand what's on the network. You need to understand the lateral movement, the east-west and the north-south traffic that is going inside your organization. The depth of visibility. For us to do this correctly, we have to have enough understanding of the devices that are in this environment to realistically be able to understand what is what. We might know it's a Windows system or it's a Unix system, but that's not what we really want to understand. We want to know it's either a work laptop or it might be, if you're in the medical profession, a machine that's operating on a human being. Or if you're a manufacturing company, it might be an industrial controller of some type. And it isn't good enough to simply know the operating system, maybe know IP address and MAC address. Those are good baseline things to understand. But the reality is we need a much higher depth of visibility to be able to truly differentiate. There are hundreds of thousands. We're approaching millions of different combinations of devices and operating systems. And to really understand what those devices are, that depth needs to be substantially stronger. And then you need to understand what of these systems is speaking to other systems in a more real-time capacity here. It is, many of the cyber products were built at a time when, every 30 days or once a week or even once a day was good enough to be able to understand a current snapshot The reality is we have, it's 5-10 years ago when we would track an attack on a Windows machine, if your vulnerability management product or your antivirus product found it 24 hours later, that was fine. It probably hadn't opened up yet and done something. But in today's day and age, you guys understand this as well as anybody, we have polymorphic attacks where the malware comes in pieces, it reassembles very quickly, it executes. When you listen to someone like FireEye tell you that there's 200 and something days between when a 0-day infects and when it's detected for the first time, that's a great data point for us to understand that malware is not trying to get into your environment to do something the second it gets there. Many of the attacks these days can sit undetected for an extended period of time, and our ability to really make sure in real time that our systems are talking in the right way is very important. And then the last data point about what best defense are, and this is a really difficult one, is we have to isolate specialized devices with embedded operating systems that cannot be upgraded. And I'm going to tell you a short story here that I think really brings this to life, because I think it's equally as challenging an issue for the automotive manufacturers, which is, I live in California. We haven't necessarily been proud in the US of the cars that we've produced, but Tesla has changed things a little bit for us. And we now have a car that is more desirable worldwide. And I would tell you that one of the reasons that the car is more desirable worldwide is that they have cracked the code on something that's very, very different. For years, and most cars even today, if you buy a 2015 versus a 2018 version of the exact same car, you effectively get an older version of the operating system, right? If that auto manufacturer the next year comes out with a new GPS, a new radio, whatever the system would be, the old cars don't get the benefit of that. That's rolled out in the new cars. And one of the things that Tesla challenged was there's no buttons in the car, there's one giant screen, and that screen represents a computer in your car. And when you come home at night and you park in your garage and it tells you this little icon lights up in your car, it says there's an upgrade and it's going to install at midnight. You come out the next day. If Tesla overnight has produced a 4G version of their Google Maps instead of a 3G version, every single car they've ever sold inherits that. So the reason I highlight that story to you is it's an example of an industry where for years we had these kind of purpose-built appliances, a car with a version of an operating system that was highly locked down and was not upgraded on a more regular basis. And we have that same challenge in our OT world these days. I think WannaCry and NotPetya really highlighted something pretty concerning in the world, which is it isn't that we have an industrial control system that you might have bought from some vendor in one of your machine plants. What you really have is an old version of XP that's embedded in somebody's operating system that's on a network that is connected to all your other networks. And the ability for a bad actor to exploit that is very strong. So there's two sides to this. On the first side, every manufacturing company worldwide now is scrambling with the concept of how do they patch those devices in a more real-time manner. They have to. The answer cannot be to take devices offline. These are in some of the most mission-critical areas. We've got to make sure that we demand the same thing from those manufacturers. Customers are demanding that same thing. But in cases where they cannot be potentially upgraded as regularly as an open system would be, the other approach towards this is really towards network segmentation. I've had a bunch of meetings at this conference, and it's one of the questions that I try to ask everybody is kind of what's your approach towards network segmentation? Because the reality is you're going to have the switch vendors coming to you, wanting you to accomplish segmentation of the network at the switch level. You're going to have the firewall vendors coming to you. To the same way that you secured the perimeter with firewalls, they now want to propose firewalls inside the enterprise to be able to segment the network. You have the virtualization vendors like VMware coming to you, telling you that you should do it through virtualization. NSX is the way that you segment the network. And then you've got this whole portfolio of smaller companies The one that I think is the most high profile at this stage is Illumio, who comes at it from a software perspective, and they want to provide a software product that's going to help you fence in kind of like applications from a certain use case inside the organization. This is a very big decision that you will make as organizations because it has the potential to lock you in to a certain architectural approach toward your network. SDN, the whole concept of software-defined networking and network segmentation as a single topic is one of the largest decisions that I believe that you will make as an industry over this next couple of years. But it's a very important aspect to this, which is, you look at a breach like Target as an example, and I'm sure you've all read all of the details. That's many years old, but in my simple scenario, Target represents an example where what should have been the least privileged thing that you let on your network, a contractor that is able to come into your building with a badge and get online for the purposes of one thing, which is updating their own system, which is their HVAC system. The second that device hit the network, we learned very quickly that Target had a very large flat network, because within minutes, the malware had moved from the least privileged device to the most secure device on that entire network, which is their point of sale systems. And I don't think that's uncommon. I mean, it's very expensive to implement tiered networks, but network segmentation is a very important topic that we will all bite off on, because the reality is keeping your IoT devices secure and away from your managed assets. And we've had this concept of guest networks for years, and the ability to keep guest away from IoT and IoT away from managed and managed away from data center and all of these different things. In a certain way, you can put some fences up inside of your network, which will help you through this issue. And then the last piece is around being willing to remediate, automate. This is a tough one. Part of our solution is that we don't just identify devices that are on the network. When you find something that isn't compliant with what you want it to be, it's a device that has a version of an operating system you don't want, or it's an IoT device that's speaking to something you wouldn't want, we actually give you the ability to go down to the individual switch port and take that device off automatically. And the comment I get back all the time from customers is, what happens if you block our CEO's laptop or someone like that? And I can tell you as a CEO that if my laptop had something on it that was going to cause damage to my corporation, I would certainly wish that our products had stopped it versus allowing it to come in simply because it's my laptop. And I still think there's this massive resistance around the world to automate. Many of you build large security operations centers, and you try to keep up with the demand of malware that's coming into your environment, but the reality is that the concept that you're going to put a human being in every single decision of what you do from a cyber perspective is flawed. There is no way. As the world moves to 20 and 30 and 50 and 100 billion devices eventually, there is no opportunity. You're going to have to be willing to automate. You're going to have to be willing to let cybersecurity products take action on non-compliant devices and then notify your security operations center, not the opposite. And I know that's a really tough one. It's the conversation that I always have is, okay, leave your CEO for last, but what about IoT? What if the security cameras that are in this room get together and try to take down your SAP backend? Do you want to wait until your security operations center analyzes this and loads data into Splunk and correlates it and sees if it's concerning? Or do you want to take those security cameras offline? And I think that, kind of IoT, any device that would be not assigned or owned by a single human being is a really good place to start on being willing to automate. And I think that's going to carry through many of the different products. I mean, you saw Splunk make an acquisition of Phantom earlier this year. You're seeing other companies that are trying to get into this orchestration space. In many cases, what they're trying to do is they're trying to help you have tools that let you automate some of this. But I understand, as a CISO or a CIO that runs a major IT organization and all the challenges and pushback that you might get from your user community, this is not an easy decision to make. But if you believe the volume that I showed you on the first slide, it seems very impractical. we're going to have as many IoT devices in 2020 as we have human beings on the planet, and it's safe to assume that that's probably going to grow at a faster level than our population will. I mean, at some point, you're just going to have a sheer volume issue that you're not going to be able to stick people in the middle of that. And again, kind of the Mirai botnet was really, in my view, the first really high-profile attack that kind of brought this issue to light. When it first went down, I remember reading the news stories in the first 24 hours, and it's, those security camera manufacturers need to be more careful. Yeah, as IT professionals, that's not practical for you. You can't possibly assume that every single, IT organization that you buy from is going to be responsible for their own security. You're going to have some central way to allow devices into your environment, and if they're not behaving the way that you want them to be able to automatically remediate those devices. So, in conclusion, I personally believe that this growing space of visibility, this concept of simply knowing what's on your network to begin with, it's going to be one of the biggest challenges that you grapple with as an IT organization. You're dealing with it today. It's going to get exponentially larger for you over the upcoming years. The positive side, I'm a father of 3 young children, and they've never known anything except being connected. From when they were 8 years old, they were asking me for iPhones. And the reality is that the generation that we've raised underneath us is coming into the workforce with this immediate connection. It's one of the things I always tell my kids, that they download an application, they just hit yes, 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 yes. They don't read anything. They accept any terms. They allow it to be online in a very automated fashion. And the beauty of it is the number of use cases out there that leverage this connected world are incredible. We already have this, but the concept that you might be able to be driving to work in the morning and you can just talk to your car and it'll help you catch up on your email or your voicemail or all that stuff just in a very intuitive way is there. But recognize that car now is on your company's network, and you as business professionals are going to have to deal with that side that comes with it. One of the larger industries that we sell into is the healthcare industry, and when you look at the amount of innovation that is coming into healthcare, it's incredible. There's clothing now, sweaters that a small microfiber can be stitched in, and if you're susceptible to a heart attack, they might be able to give this to you and give the doctor a 48-hour notice when you're going to have a heart attack. There's drug companies that believe we might be in a position where if you get the flu or a cold, one pill might be able to be designed that interacts perfectly with your own DNA and solves it in a single pill. And it's the amount of innovation that we're going to see in the next 10 years, I believe, is going to make the first 25 years of the internet seem very, very simple. But the reality is, for every cool, interesting use case that we can think up from a connected world perspective, there's a counter side to that, which is there's a security challenge that we've all chosen to make our professions out of trying to keep organizations safe. And that visibility issue, just simply understanding kind of what is on your networks as a starting point, we believe is going to be a very important part of this. So thank you for your time today. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take those.